Hello, everybody. This is Susu Duga from Parent Information Network of Cherry Creek School District, welcoming you to our March 2nd, 2021 presentation of 1 year later. COVID before, during, after, all the craziness of this last year with our great speaker, Dr. Jacaranda Palmateer from DU. Before we start, we'd like to just tell you a couple of things. We want to thank all of you who encouraged your kids and informed them about our Sherry Shepherd Sargent Scholarship. That application process closed as of last night, and we have some amazing applications from our seniors, and we will be informing them of any needs for interviewing, and we'll let them know who the scholarship winners are come early April. Right now, I'd like to introduce to you Bobby Turner, who was my co-chair for a few years and is now our treasurer on the board. She is going to let you know of some opportunities for you. Bobby?
Good morning, everyone. So once again, I'm here to recommend that you strongly consider volunteering with PIN. We always have a need for really good volunteers, and it's a great group to join. Today, I just want to point out that volunteering with PIN can be a great way to develop job skills. So if you're looking to improve your job skills in areas like marketing, writing, public relations, finance, leadership, or website management, this could be a great way to do that. Right now, we're specifically looking for someone to help as a programming assistant. That would be someone who works closely with Susu, who is wonderful, to interface with our speakers, just to make sure that they're all set with everything they need for the monthly presentations. So that is one role that we're looking for, but we also have just so many other ways to get involved. So we would love to hear from you if you are interested in volunteering with us. You can email us at pinccsd@gmail.com. So thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Yes, I look forward to someone helping me find more amazing speakers like we've had this year and in the past, and communicating with them. So please reach out to that email and we'll get in touch with you. We also wanted to let you know that next month, April 6th, we have a little bit different setup for our presentation. We'll have an interactive session with the Chief of Staff of CCSD to hear from you about the next chapter of CCSD, looking into our leadership, our programming, just a bunch of questions that CCSD is excited to offer to us in the district. So you'll get more information about that as well. We also have an exciting offer that's been generously and graciously given to us by Kent Denver, who is a member of Penn as a private school. They have offered to have us join them for a presentation on Thursday night, this Thursday, by a nationally known speaker. So check your email. That will be coming out this afternoon. Remember that if there's something that you hear today on our presentation and you wish that you could listen to it again to get the nuts and bolts of it, or to pass it on to someone else, this presentation, you get to listen to it now live, or you get to listen to it later, and you can pass that on to someone else. So know that all the presentations that have happened this year have been taped and are available to you through our website, pinccsd.com. I think that is all the business we need to go over right now. So I would like to introduce you to Dr. Jacaranda Palmateer, who I met while we were both volunteering at Bellevue Elementary in the Shakespeare program. And I will let her tell you a little bit more about her work within Cherry Creek School District in the wellness community, as well as what she's doing with college students at DU. But more importantly, how all of this is going to help us during this most epic year of the pandemic. So if you have any questions, please feel free to jot them down in the Q&A or in the chat. I think the chat is open as well. You can jot comments down, questions down, and we will get to those. We'll be monitoring those, and we will um, be offering those up to Dr. Palmateer to answer as they come up. So get your pen and paper ready, your cup of tea and coffee, and get ready to learn some great information right now. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Susu. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And yeah, the Q&A probably is the easiest part, of course. And the presentation went away. Just a second. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about mental health and coping during and after COVID. So sorry, my slideshow decided to act out. So hopefully everyone can see this. Okay, please let me know if there's any issues with that, or you can let the awesome PIN people know. They can probably let me know. So I'm planning to present for 45 minutes. And I think the Q&A works, I think really well just for presenters. That's a really easy way to see what needs to be responded to maybe during the presentation. And I'm happy to answer questions that are relevant if I kind of get through a section and it feels like I haven't answered as much as you had hoped. The chat, I think too, for comments is totally fine. I did want to say what this is not. I am a psychologist, and I'm going to be primarily focusing on the impact of mental health and kind of the state of mental health for all of us, and especially for all of our kiddos that are in school right now. But I'm not going to be analyzing the metrics around why schools should be open or should they not, or the public health issues. So really going to be focused on the mental health. This is just an outline so you have an idea of what I'm going to go through to so you know what I can get to later if you have some questions. So I really like data. I really like understanding kind of what the research is saying about what's happening from a mental health perspective. What's interesting about COVID is research usually takes some time. And so we do have some research. I think that the research and the information we have on trends is going to really have a lot more to say in the next few years. But I think for now we do have some, and we also have some self-report information, things like that, that I think are really helpful to just be able to hear from a lot of different places and people kind of what the trends are, what people's experiences are. I'm going to talk about the social and relational impacts. It's been a really significant issue for youth right now. And then just mental health in general, what to look for around mental health issues in children and adolescents, and what to do about that. I think also something that has come up a lot with this collective stressor that we've all been going through together is grief and loss issues are pretty significant. So we're going to talk some about that. And then also this idea of trauma versus stress and a collective stressor. And so we have the language to be able to talk about what we're all going through. And I think, again, some of this won't be a surprise at all to most of you, but then just wellness and support, kind of what can we do, and how do we look forward right now? And then I think there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. So just wanted to tell you a little bit about me. So I did attend the University of Denver for graduate school, graduated in 2005. So I've been a licensed psychologist in Colorado for about 15 years now, which is hard to believe. I do specialize in late adolescent and young adult mental health primarily, but do work with people and have worked with people from all ranges of the spectrum. Probably 5 or 6 is the youngest, but I've worked with people in their 70s as well. So full range generalist. This is my 9th year as a parent in the school district. I have a couple kids in middle school and one in elementary school, and currently campus in Bellevue are our home schools. And yes, I met Susu through the Cherry Creek School District Wellness Committee, which I joined in 2019. So got to see the amazing work that a lot of people within Cherry Creek School District are doing. I think the metrics and the surveying they do and the data they're collecting there is pretty phenomenal. And so I think I don't have that data here, but I think that they're going to have a lot of data and a lot of information about the impact of this, is because they were already looking and already had 10 years or so of data. So, oh yeah, and that's me with my family skiing, you know, the true Colorado. So just to jump in here, and again, the PIN members can let me know if there's anything I need to answer. But I think an important context that we have to have right now is what was happening in mental health before COVID. And I think the reality is that we were seeing a steady rise in the incidence of mental health issues already. So this hasn't been a dramatic change, but it has been significant, and something I presented on a bit prior to COVID was just the impact of technology use actually on mental health, and that is one of the factors that has contributed to people feeling like increasingly isolated or disconnected from others. Now we all are relying on technology a lot, and I think technology has also revealed to us some of the incredible resources that we have to connect to each other as well. And we also know there's the shadow side of technology, and so that is part of what was happening, but not the only thing. Just increase awareness, increase understanding, things like that. But I think I'm going to present some data on this because I think it's useful to have that context. So thinking about from 2005 to 2014, we saw a couple percentage increase in the prevalence of major depressive episodes in adolescence. So we're talking about diagnosed mental health conditions. And I think that is one of the really important things to keep in mind as we look at these different trends and this different data, is that, some of the data we're looking at is actually at the diagnosable conditions, and then some is just about the impact and stressors. And so what we know is that pre-COVID, mental health was one of the main drivers of the global burden of disease. So what that means is that mental health plays a significant role in people's wellness and well-being. And it was a substantial problem before this pandemic. And I think one of the huge problems was around access and inequities in healthcare around mental health and around healthcare in general. So in the United States, historically, marginalized communities having less impact or having a lot of mistrust of an institution of health that has been oppressive to them in the past, things like that. So to really keep in mind that there was a lot going on that we were talking about and really concerned about, honestly, pre-COVID. And especially, I think, in youth and young adults, this really measurable and statistically significant increase in mental health issues. And I think what's hard about mental health in particular is because there's still stigma, and because the healthcare system, a lot of healthcare systems don't prioritize and don't recognize the need for more preventative or supportive mental health care, that there's a huge gap between those who need mental health services and the availability to get those services, or just the barriers to get those services. Sometimes they're internal, sometimes they're external. So just a little bit more about pre-COVID mental health trend. So this is a snapshot of data that was published in 2019. So about 10% of kids aged 2 to 17 have received an ADHD diagnosis. I mean, that's 1 in 10. That's a fair number of people. So if we think about that, when I'm going to talk a little bit about ADHD later, that's important. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is the umbrella term. So inattentive and hyperactive and combined type all fall under the ADHD category. ADD is kind of an outdated term. The other thing is anxiety. This, I think, is definitely an underestimate for right now, but about 7% of kids, and there is a lot of comorbidity. So a lot of people that have both ADHD and anxiety. Depression, 3%, which again, I'm going to show you some data that that says that it's a lot higher than that, but I think this might be 2014 or 2015 data. So to keep in mind, these are the people that actually went somewhere, got diagnosed with depression, and are being treated for depression. And really for all of this, that's how we're going to track this, versus that there's a lot of folks out there that probably are not getting diagnosed or treated, especially as I talked about later in those groups that maybe don't have access for a lot of different reasons, you know, economic reasons or racial disparity reasons, things like that. Something to think about. So mental health disorders account for 16% of the global burden of disease and injury. So again, we're talking about a pretty significant issue in terms of something that is affecting our youth today and adults. I'm going to mostly focus on youth, but I'll talk a little bit about college students too. So just another graph that illustrates the escalation and looking at the gender differences. Again, I'm not going to go into that too much. I think there's gender differences in most presenting issues, especially when you look at youth, and that's a pretty complicated thing to talk in depth about because it has a lot to do with a lot of factors around context and expectations in different cultures. But so this data says 25% of teens meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. So again, we were looking at the age group of 3 to 17, and now looking at just the teens, we're talking about 1 in 4 kids between the ages of 7 and 6, about 8%, so almost 1 in 10, so 1 in 12 maybe have attempted self-injury, self-harm of some kind. And then eating disorders, and I'm going to talk a little bit about eating disorders because that has been one area that we've seen some increase in exacerbation in during COVID. But again, just another graph to help you all see some of these changes. Okay, so now to get into the COVID specific. So this is actually some data from China. So I think in looking at the data for this presentation, I think actually we have more data from China than we do have from anywhere else right now because they basically started before us. So they got a 3-month start on us, which I'm sure they're not particularly glad about, but they have some data that we don't have. So I think what this graph shows you is how much this was happening in the percentage in the population studied. And I think a lot of what we see in kids, we see, I think, a twofold response. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when I talk specifically about anxiety, but I think a part of what we're seeing is some kids are really scared about COVID. So they're really scared about themselves or one of their loved ones getting the virus and potentially dying from the virus. I think the other kind of source of anxiety is quarantine and social isolation, social distancing, the impact of that. And so I think in this, you're not going to see a difference in that data, but I think that's a good way to think about it is the person you're working with really scared of COVID? Are they really anxious, or the person that your kid that you're interacting with, are they really scared of COVID? Do they have real fears about themselves or someone else getting the disease? Or is it a reaction to the social environment they're in related to just all the changes that they've experienced because of the pandemic. So just looking at this, sleep being affected a lot, worrying about what's happening, wanting to know more, irritability, inattention, clingy. So pretty significant data here on how many kids are being affected. So I think when you do talk about the main impacts of COVID, I think academic distress actually in the college population and in the school age population is number one. So what we know, and we do have some data and research, I mean, luckily we have had people doing online learning for some time. This is not a brand new concept. So we do have data in that online learning is more difficult for most kiddos. I think that usually when I'm talking to people, I say, 15 to 20% of kids and adolescents or young adults or even adults actually are going to thrive in this environment. They're more introverted. They're not going to miss the social connection as much. Maybe they felt pressure and anxiety about being in some social situations. And they're really good at learning this way. They're visual auditory learners. They can focus. They don't have attention issues. And so there are some kids thriving right now, which I think is one of these things that it's kind of hard to make sense of. But I think the reality is the majority aren't. The majority are struggling. And I think at the college level, we see this, as the number one issue that has increased in concern. And I think that's true for the school age group as well, that how do we make sure we're learning enough? How do we concentrate? How do we learn in this way? I think one of the silver linings or positives that I'm going to talk about later is that, I think my third grader is learning skills that are going to help her in college. And I think that they're not great for her to learn right now, but I think there will be some payoffs. There will be some positives that will come out of this. So again, academic distress, number one for most people. I think, 1 in 5 kids are going to be thriving. And I think that's great. Let's encourage them. We know that they're going to be fine taking online classes when they get to college. They can take online trainings for job-related processes, things like that. And that's great to know that that's a way that you thrive. And really to encourage that, support that, and then really that to know that most students right now are struggling around academics. So anxiety, and again, I mentioned this already, I think, especially early on, and I think particularly around kids or youth that have directly been impacted by the virus and seen the more severe or long-lasting impact that COVID can have. Their anxiety can truly be, or have a family member who's immune compromised, or, for a lot of reasons that they might feel really worried. They're going to school and the rest of their family is doing online learning, or they have someone at home, their grandparent lives with them. Luckily in Colorado, hopefully most of the grandparents are vaccinated at this point. But I think before this, it was really feeling concerned that they could bring home the virus and it could hurt or kill someone they loved. And I think that is a real thing. And so I think understanding that as a source of anxiety is important, in terms of how you talk to a kid about how to cope with those feelings and how to manage that, and how to, not take on kind of the weight of the world. I think the other impact on anxiety that we're really seeing is related to the social environment that we're in. People, especially youth, I think especially teenagers, not being able to be around their friends as much, not meeting new people, not being able to participate in sports, spending more time on screens. They're not doing the social tasks of adolescence right now, or maybe they're doing it 50% of the time, and that's really hard, and that's going to really impact them. And I think, I'm sure all of you can relate to this too, that just in general, that when is this going to end and how much longer, and all of that sense of feeling out of control and not knowing what's going on is really distressing. Depression, I think, again, is something we've seen an increase in. I think we've seen a larger increase in anxiety for sure, but I think just that heaviness and that weight that comes from losing things and being impacted in this way and not having what you expected to have, and, you know, changes in your family or losses, or there's lots of things. But I think, you know, for people that have pre-existing or already were struggling with depression, you what we saw as an exacerbation of that, or an episode of it, if it's an episodic disorder. And then I think some people just experiencing situational depression. So maybe they didn't already have an existing mental health diagnosis, but just the weight of this and what they've missed out on, and what they've lost is a lot. Substance use, hopefully not in the younger kiddos, but I know in adults, adolescents, college students, particularly, I think, you know, isolation, it's a common way people cope with isolation. I think, you know, it's a way for people to kind of take a break emotionally from what's going on. And I think that, you know, using it as a release and a decompression is one thing. I think using it to cope can become really problematic. And I think what we've seen throughout this is people, you know, in crisis tend towards the more negative coping. So things like substance use. Eating disorders, we've seen an exacerbation in this as well. I think that some of the social context that helps eating disorders stay managed, environmental kind of support, stressors, things like that. I think people being more isolated and kind of more in their head can really drive that to worsen over time. I think also looking at yourself on a screen can also be a source of distress for people as well. And so that's something to keep in mind. We've definitely seen a modest increase in some of those, and an exacerbation. So I think when we're thinking about pre-existing conditions, people that already had a diagnosis, I think what we saw a lot of was an exacerbation or an increase in symptoms. And again, these are manageable, but I think that, you know, people that had diagnoses already are going to be more vulnerable during this time. ADHD, I think I mentioned this earlier, but this is a big one because we're talking about 1 in 10 kids, at least, that have that diagnosis. And really, what I will say is the virtual learning environment is about twice as hard for those of us who don't have ADHD. So paying attention to people on a screen takes a lot of concentration. You know, to learn in this environment without the social cues, without the environmental cues is hard. It requires more work. And what we know about ADHD is that a task like that is not just 2 times as hard, it's 10 times as hard. So these kids that have ADHD are working 10 times as hard when the rest of us are working twice as hard. So that's helpful to think about that. I think also learning issues, kids that are neurodiverse, and then children with disabilities. I think that those are populations that we've really worried about. Is, you know, we just don't have the data. We don't have the interactive software in some ways to really help mitigate some of that. Like, we can't at this point simulate an in-person environment. I think that the virtual reality, and there's some software that does that simulates someone kind of being in the room with you. But, you know, that's still not going to be the same as someone being in a social environment and having the support that they need at school around learning, or, you know, social skills, things like that. So I think this group has been really impacted. And I think that thinking about students also that don't have access to technology, I think what we saw in the spring was about 1/5 of kids that were under-resourced or from kind of historically oppressed populations not having access, and, you know, a huge truancy rate related to that, because of a lack of access, a lack of really good internet connection or computers, things like that. I know Cherry Creek did a really lovely job of trying to get support to those students, but I think that we're in a school district that could do that, where there's a lot throughout the country that really didn't have that option. So I think thinking about these specific group of students that are impacted related to pre-existing conditions, as well as folks that already were experiencing disparities related to access and health, really have disproportionately been impacted by this. So I already mentioned this. I'm just going to say a little bit more about academic distress as the most significant measure. And I really think, again, I'm not going to talk about the pros or cons of sending kids back to school. I think there's some really interesting data out there that goes into how and why they make those decisions. You know, it's cost benefit. And I think it's pretty fascinating, but it's not really mental health. But I think what has contributed to academics distress, right, is reduced learning that the students have experienced. I think also that cost of struggling so much emotionally, like that to struggle. I think about that ADHD kid who was sitting there trying to pay attention, and just like the emotional cost, the emotional effort that takes. I think also just like coping with how people are coping with it, and then how that just kind of piles on the stress. And I think the other piece, right, is like how the school situation has been stressful to parents and caregivers. So the parents who don't have time to do their work or to help their kids, and are not as productive at work. And I think there's a lot of people that have jobs that were amenable to moving to an online environment, but a lot of people didn't. And so then it's, are they out of the home and being exposed, or did they lose their job? So I think that cost too was a part of what goes into the academic distress for students. Okay. So I think the other piece is just about relationships. So I think that everyone probably in this presentation can think about times that or ways that you've seen your relationships impacted, the decrease in social circles, the just decreased in-person time. You know, here I am in my office today. There's 5 or 6 other people here. I'll probably spend a total of, 8 to 10 minutes passing them in the hallways or checking in briefly. But, that's different than the, hours I used to spend in person with people a day. So it's hard to have this be interactive, I think, in some ways, but so I'll just give you the answer to this next question. But I think what the research says, and this is from the book Wellbeing by Rath and Harder, is that we actually need 6 hours of social interaction a day to have good mental health. 6 hours of social interaction. So that's not just like sitting next to somebody, but that's actually interacting with people. So just something to think about in terms of what maybe you're getting, what your kids are getting compared to what really facilitates good mental health. I think the other piece right now is around planned versus unplanned social engagement. I think for adults, I think there's some loss in this. Maybe there's people we would have met that we didn't meet, things like that. Maybe we're not seeing as many of our friends as we usually do. I think though, for students, for youth, that college students, high school especially, that they're having to make choices around safety in terms of who they expose themselves to, and they have to make decisions about whether meeting someone new is worth it. And I think that in some ways that's an important skill to really pay attention to more variables when you're meeting new people. And really, there's just not the option for those unplanned interactions that you don't know maybe would have been a meaningful friendship that you developed, and yet you don't want to move outside of your circle. You don't want to expose other people, so you haven't. So I think it's the absence of something is hard to measure, and so I just like to think about that kind of the unplanned versus the planned. I mentioned this earlier around screen time, which is something I was really interested in pre-COVID, around the impact of screen time and being online, technology use, and mental health, because I think we've seen really interesting data happen particularly since the invention of smartphones. And I have a smartphone, and it is a wonderful tool, and happy to be able to FaceTime with grandparents on there. And yet at the same time, there are some significant drawbacks, and there's a shadow side of the way we use technology right now and how it impacts our mental health. And I think what's hard, right, is that we know that online relationships are tangibly worse than in-person relationships. We just know that, I think that if I had $1 for every time I had a client in college who had met someone online and was chatting with them and was so excited and thought they were so great, and then they met in person and they were like, whoa, no. I think it's just, there's so much data that we get from people in person that you can't even compare those two. And yet, connecting via FaceTime or Google Duo or whatever you use with your grandparents, is such a gift right now. And so I think understanding two-dimensional is better than none, but really knowing that it's been a loss. It's been a real loss in terms of that connection that we have in person. So just because this is my area of specialty, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the college trends, just because I think they're interesting and they're really similar to the school age folks as well. So I think the self-report data says people are have reported increased concerns in eating and family distress, and then academic distress is kind of the most significant. And similarly, depression, anxiety, social anxiety, alcohol use. So all of those have actually remained relatively stable. So really eating concerns, family, academic distress, and anxiety is complicated. We've seen some increase in anxiety in college, but we've seen some decrease. And I think we really understand that. I'm going to show you a slide momentarily. We really understand that as being related to kind of people that had social anxiety aren't feeling as anxious right now. So I think there's always a silver lining. So this is just the Center for Collegiate Mental Health. And this is a lot of data, hundreds of thousands of college students that are coming into college counseling centers and what they're seeking services. And so this is looking at students that are seeking services due to COVID versus that are saying that it's not because of COVID. So as you can see, I just wanted to show you this. They reported higher rates of negative life impacts across all areas. So I think what is important about that is partly the perception and the understanding of what's going on. And students that feel like I'm really impacted and what I'm struggling with is due to COVID, they're actually experiencing more distress than people are able to say, like, I feel just really lonely. I want to seek support based on that. So we can talk about that a little later. I think that's a really interesting point. And this actually is same data, Center for Collegiate Mental Health. And this is looking at fall 2019 to fall 2020. And the blue basically is what's gotten kind of worse. So we've seen a 6% increase in the reporting of stress, social isolation, general anxiety. But then when you go down, you actually see people are reporting less concerns about some issues, right? So relationship problems, they're not in as many relationships, maybe social anxiety, things like that. So, and really negligible impact on a lot of areas that we would think would be really significantly impacted. So we're looking at, this is a general group that is seeking services. So I think, again, like I said earlier, that's really important because I think we have the general population and then we have the population that's actually seeking services, and we have data sets from both. And it's important to keep in mind and not conflate those two, because I think, a clinical population is different than the general population, and we really need to understand both populations. Okay, so now just to think about your own, your own kiddos in your own house, or their friends, or even yourselves or people in your lives. So this is really what I'd want you to think about related to, okay, so knowing all this, knowing there's a lot of mental health going on pre-COVID, knowing that some people are really experiencing more distress because of COVID. Overall, it's not kind of as bad in some ways as we think, but I think the increase in stress and kind of non-clinical anxiety is pretty significant for a lot of people. I think the next question is, like, when is it serious? When do I need to do something about it? And so this is just some guidance, and I think this is from WHO, from the World Health Organization, guidelines around when to seek help. So I think when something is persistent, right? So we really think about kind of episodic versus persistent in terms of some diagnoses. So I think persistent sadness, depression, the 2 or more weeks. So a couple of days of feeling bad about something, again, unless someone's feeling suicidal or, really can't function at all. I think we're looking for the pattern in that. Withdrawing from or avoiding social interaction. So again, I think it might be hard to measure in some ways right now, but that's important. I think hurting oneself or talking about hurting oneself or talking about hurting others, obviously that's something you want to not mess around with at all, that you want to seek help immediately on that. Outbursts or extreme irritability. I think sometimes depression gets missed in young men or boys because they often present as more irritable and not as sad. Out of control behavior that can be harmful. So really significant risk taking without kind of a awareness of their mortality, their way they might hurt others. Drastic changes in mood or behavior. Changes in eating habits again. This is one I'd really look for in kiddos right now. Is that's a sign sometimes that us parents can see more than some of these other ones if they're not talking to us about it. But if their eating starts to really change, or they're losing weight or gaining a lot of weight unintentionally, something really to pay attention to. Sleeping, I think probably everyone on this call can attest to maybe having some sleep disruption related to this. So I think that's a big one that we look for. And again, what we're looking for is persistence. So having a few nights of struggle, is actually just really normal. There's going to be times that are more stressful in all of our lives. And so it's the pattern of problem that you want to look out for. The somatic symptoms, so frequent headaches and stomach aches, you're really going to see some kids that's how they manifest their anxiety or even depression, that they are experiencing physical symptoms. And that's our body's kind of amazing way of trying to be like, oh, you're not paying attention to the internal cues. I'm going to give you some external cues about what's going on too. Difficulty concentrating. Again, I think maybe a significant change in this is what you'd want to look for. That's not just attributable to the virtual learning environment. Changes in academic performance. Again, I think that this is one of those ones that, normally we would maybe able to demarcate more in terms of like, wow, this is a significant change. Whereas I know some students have just really struggled in the academic environment we're in right now. But I think, again, their interest in school, their engagement, things like that, you'd want to pay attention to. And avoiding or missing school. I know that depending on where your kid is, this could or could not apply if they're in elevations or if they're doing online school most of the time. But I think even avoiding that or not wanting to go to school on the days. And again, we're looking for not like a day here and there. We're looking for a persistent and significant change around this. Oh, okay. I'm getting it might be a question for me to look at. Oh, is it in the chat?
We have a couple of questions. If you could tell us the author of the book you referenced, Well-Being.
Sure. It is in the slides. I'd have to go back. It's called Wellness, and I think do you want me to go back? I can go back if that's.
You know what? We'll see if one of us can get it offline and
okay.
in the chat. The book is called Wellness.
Yeah. I think, or Well-Being.
Okay. And then the other question was when you mentioned difficulty sleeping, how about kind of the opposite of that, where a kiddo wants to sleep and lay in bed all the time?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That is a big sign that we look for and look at around depression usually. So that's something you would look at too, sleeping a lot more than they need for their age range and than what was typical of them before.
I've got one other question just of my own.
Sure.
I've always had this question of when there is something that is validly and objectively sad, whether it's COVID, whether it's a divorce in the family, a death, a loss, you should expect some of these kind of criteria or symptoms. So the biggest question to me would be, I mean, people shouldn't be jumping up and down, giggling and smiling and, having parties when something of of some sadness or depth happens. So how do you allow just the realness of the situation to process in that person or yourself, and differentiate it between something that has become more problematic?
Absolutely. Great question. I think that's really important is that life, sometimes there's some really hard things that people go through and that you would expect them to be sad. And I think what we think about is functional impairment in the mental health world. So, for a loss or a significant change, you're going to see, probably short term, someone experiencing some significant functional impairment that you would expect. And it's really the persistence, right? So I think, say, for example, with the loss of a loved one. There's going to be sadness over a long period of time. I think what you want is that someone's able to function and kind of re-enter their life and still do what they need to do in their life and take care of other people and be around other people. And it's when that's really disrupted that's when you want to think about, okay, maybe they're not kind of on the grief journey. I think it's a great lead in because pretty soon, maybe now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about grief and loss. And this too, I think, would be appropriate even for people that maybe there's not a mental health diagnosis. So even people that are just experiencing kind of a loss or change in their family. So I think probably the main thing is if you're seeing some of these symptoms really significantly, that you'd want to seek therapy and or medication. So that would be something you want professional help, you want someone else supporting your student, your kid, so they're not suffering as much and they have a path of hope and moving forward. I think you can also learn about the diagnosis, get some books. There's online training courses for parents, things like that. There's a lot you can do to understand. And I think that can be incredibly helpful for your kid in terms of helping destigmatize it for them, helping them understand it better, and helping you not kind of feel like what they're doing is in some ways an affront to you or acting out, things like that. Family counseling can be really helpful depending on the issue. And again, depending on the issue, really collaborating in the age of your kid, really collaborating with your mental health providers on how to respond and handle those more challenging behaviors. Stress management techniques for you. So I think that's one of the big takeaways, as I would say, from all of this, is that this is a collective stressor and we're all going through it at the same time as our kids, the same time as our teachers, for me, the same time as my clients. And so we as parents need those stress management techniques as well. We need to be taking care of our own mental health as well. Seek fun ways to relax and have fun with your child. So I think to make sure that not everything is about their diagnosis, really focusing on their strengths and abilities. So I think that it can feel like a failure for some people to have a mental health diagnosis. What we know is it's not. That's part of the problem with the stigma of it. But it can feel like somehow a personal shortcoming, whereas I don't know anyone who thinks about type 1 diabetes as a personal shortcoming. So it's interesting that we apply that to mental health. But I think to really understand that it's not, it's just, how we're neurologically built, and to really focus on the strengths and abilities and then work with your child through school, which I think is particularly challenging right now. I will say in the current environment, but also still really important. So I've mentioned this a little bit, and I think that a lot of people will talk about, the trauma of all this. And I think the reality is that for some people, they have experienced a trauma during this time. They've lost a family member, or they've had someone get sick and almost die. They have had bad things happen in their home or in their family that have caused them to have trauma, and really had one of these events that, is a threat of death or severe injury. I mean, that's what we understand. A traumatic response comes from that, where someone might have intrusive memories and thoughts. They might have nightmares. They might work really hard to avoid cues and reminders. They might, be hypervigilant, things like that. So, in the mental health world, we think about trauma as big T trauma and little t trauma. So there are a lot of things that are kind of, we experience as traumatic, but they might not cause a trauma response. When you think about a collective stressor, which really is what a pandemic is. So this is a collective stressor, right? It's kind of like when a town has a hurricane or a tornado that really, impacts everybody, right? Again, there might be more trauma with that, but for some people, it's going to be more of a collective stressor, the rebuilding, how do you move forward from that? And I think what's really common with that is sadness, feelings of loss, worry, anxiety, sleep disturbance, exactly what we're seeing, right? So again, some people right now are experiencing more of a trauma response to what's going on and feel like they're in crisis all the time, whereas a lot, I'd say the majority of people are really experiencing what we see as like collective stress. So, and thinking about it that way of that, I think what Susu was saying too is like some of this is just normal. It's a normal response to what's going on. And so really, really acknowledging and accepting that that's a part of what's happening, right? Versus pathologizing it. And I think in this presentation, I think importantly, don't want us to pathologize kind of what is normal. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of collective grief. So, I think that some people might really be grieving. I mean, we've had 500,000 deaths in the United States from COVID. And so it's probably more today than it was when I looked at that data. But, there's a lot of people that have been directly impacted by the loss of a loved one to this virus. And so their grief process, is related to that. It could be related to decreased access to them during the virus, or even someone who had a health emergency now in terms of that they couldn't go to the hospital to be with their parent or their kid or their grandparent, whoever, during this time. And I think that's important to know that that's a part of what is happening with it for some people, right? Not for everybody, but for some people, there's a lot of people affected in this way. And, to lose a loved one right now and not be able to gather as a community, not be able to comfort each other in physical ways is really hard. That's a really important part of how we grieve. So to think about that for those that are experiencing a loss, that's important. And some people are experiencing that, as well as the collective grief we all feel about the loss of our old lives and kind of how things were before. And when we went to concerts and stood shoulder to shoulder with people that we didn't know in closed buildings, and that wasn't a big deal, and you could go wherever you wanted and you could eat out wherever you wanted. And that's really, really hard, that we can't do that right now and don't know when or if what that's going to look like in the future. I think for a lot of our kids, this idea of interrupted milestones is significant as well. So maybe, I know my son, didn't get to have his, Bellevue Shakespeare performance in 5th grade and didn't get to have his continuation ceremony. And I think about that. And then I think about the college athletes that didn't get to do their senior year of their sport and didn't get to go study abroad. And, the seniors that didn't get to kind of have their senior year and have that closure. And I think some of that has been really hard, and there's a lot of grief and loss around that. I think also then the disruption and delay around, like, are we going to have graduation? Like what's going to happen? And people that have postponed their weddings, things like that. Like this is really hard, and there's grief around those. I think also, and I think the timing of this presentation was intentional in some ways of like also recognizing that there could be an anniversary response for some people, right? Like we're coming up on almost a year from when we shut everything down, and really recognizing that can be an emotional trigger for some people and cause some more distress. And so for all of us to be anticipating that in both ourselves as well as our kids is probably well advised. So, that's kind of the hard stuff. I mean, and hopefully it was helpful in terms of understanding the data and really thinking about kind of what to look for, normalizing what we're experiencing as a community, as a country, as a world right now. But also that there's hope, right? That that there are ways to manage this. And I think that's a part of what we're trying to learn right now is how do you cope with uncertainty? What are normal responses to stressors? So I think what we do know is that limiting the amount of time we look at the news and social media is really important. I think, an hour to 2 hours a day is probably the most we should do. I think I frequently have clients that say they're on social media 6 to 8 hours a day, which I don't know how they have time to do everything else, but I think that's really important in terms of limiting that, and that actually really impacts our wellness. Having a normal routine, even if kiddos are home, if they have asynchronous days, or what does it look like on their synchronous days? What are the weekends? If you normally had lots of sports and you don't have that right now, how do you have a normal routine? And really focusing on what you have control over right now. So hopefully what you eat, the exercise, your sleep, hygiene, maintaining all of that, I think for all of us and for our kids is really helpful, and having that structure. And again, I think this is a little bit what Susu was talking about is normalize the response and acknowledge the stressors. And there are age-based recommendations at the end of the presentation. I put a lot of links. I know Cherry Creek website has links as well. There's a lot of great resources on this. And I think just to emphasize that this idea of attributing all what you're experiencing right now to COVID actually can make people feel like their symptoms are worse. And so I think that research, what that told me, and I think I've seen it in a couple places now, is that actually really focusing on what it is, not like COVID. This is, COVID is awful and this is causing me to feel all these things, but like I feel isolated and alone, and let's focus on that. I think that's a really important piece right now that we can take from the research. And so just being mindful of the time, I think I'm still okay, but I would say the final takeaways that I have are that, I think in mental health, what we always think about, and this is where some of the health disparities are so difficult, is that what we know, the earlier intervention, the better. And so again, balancing that, normalizing what some of these kids are experiencing with also recognizing some symptoms that something might be worse and you might need more support. And I know there's a lot of us that have sought mental health support during this time, and that's really important. And I think, that's something for the mental health providers that we're dealing with, is how do we manage kind of the increased need for mental health support right now. But I think that's not something you'll have to worry about, knowing that, there are people out there and there are a lot of resources. I think that what we were seeing pre-pandemic is that the more family time people had, kind of it could be an insulation or a protective factor for people around mental health. And so actually that is a little bit of a silver lining in this, is that increase in family time for some people, and that, making sure you're hugging your kids every day, and that time spent at the dinner table, or, even if you're kind of in each other's hair all day, that you still have those spaces that you're really having intentional time, can be really protective from a mental health perspective. Staying involved in the community. So that's a plug for what this great group was saying before, staying involved, even if it's virtually. And in some ways, the virtual environment affords more opportunities for people that maybe didn't have the time or the ability to drive somewhere or meet somewhere in the middle of the day, that maybe they can be more involved now. I think I can't highlight enough the health disparities and the mental health treatment gap that we know about, and we knew about, and we're trying to sound the horn about before, but I think this pandemic has highlighted it in a way that I think we can't ignore. And my hope is that this will help us understand and prioritize mental health and health disparities in general for the future and future generations. I think the other thing is a collective stressor like this can take 18 to 24 months to recover from. So even after it's kind of over and things are really back to more of a normal life environment, even if it means we're wearing masks, maybe some places that we didn't used to, things like that, but that people are able to kind of function and move about in the world in a more typical way, or more like we were in the past, that there is going to be some rebound anxiety from that, and to anticipate that it's going to take some time, while you're in a collective stressor like this. Some of it, you can't grieve some of it yet. You're kind of just surviving some of it and trying to get through it. And so that some of that might be after the fact, and that we really might be, and we need to kind of prepare for that and understand that that's going to be a part of what happens. All right. I think that is all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the questions a little bit better.
If anybody has any questions, this would be a great time to ask Dr. Palmateer. We had a resource provided by the Wellness Office that Cherry Creek is offering. If you look at cherrycreekschools.org, page 12180, we'll see if we can put that where everybody can see. cherrycreekschools.org/page/12180, and that has some resources for you. Jacaranda, I have another question for you. If we have kids who are in their teens, kids who are in college, kids who are trying to gain that independence in a time when it's really hard because maybe their colleges aren't allowed to be in session, or they don't have those experiences. A lot of those specific losses that you mentioned in our high schoolers are more at home versus those 6 hours of social interaction that is now happening virtually or happening in the house. How do you safely, without nagging, keep track of your kids' mental health, especially if you know there's already been an issue? I know I've got somebody in my extended family who has told his mom, I don't want you to ask me about how I'm doing. I don't want you to ask me all these mental health questions every time I talk to you. So how do you do that slyly, and how do you help your kid in that situation?
Sure. I think this is an area we work on a lot with parents who are transitioning their kids to college. And I think it's really interesting because I think before I had kids, I was like, oh yeah, you just kind of let them go, like you got to let them separate. And, I think it's that perspective really changes when you realize like, oh, wow, it's a big deal to like know everything about your kids' health and mental health and wellness. And then all of a sudden not, right? That's a big change. I think we really work with parents around how to collaborate, how to be a partner in it, and also, to not be intrusive, but also, be there. So I think it's this idea of being a solid and known support person. So not withdrawing your support, not being and overly involved, but really being this consistent presence and saying like, I'm here and I'm a partner with you in this, and I know you've dealt with this before, and I just I want you to know. And, I think if you see really concerning signs, right, someone not functioning, right, either abusing substances of some kind, or, eating issues, or, self-harm, those are the times that, as a parent, you're kind of like, you're basically saying you can't function. So, I have to intervene, and I have to get you help, and support in some ways. I think, if they're not at that more significant level, I think a part of it is just how do you have a relationship with them that lets them know you're a partner in this with them, that you're a caring person that loves them and wants to support them, but also knows that they have to forge some of the path on their own. I think it's very difficult. I mean, I don't think there's an easy way to do this at all. And it's particularly trying right now with some of the college students that are home, right? And they're like, what? I don't want to, like, I'm used to functioning on my own. I don't really want to be under my parents' watchful eye. And yet at the same time, if they're struggling, you know, what that tells us is that something's not working, right? And I think for them to know, like, what your behavior tells me is that something's not working. And so, you know, maybe they're not distressed about that, which I think is a different issue. Like, if they're not distressed by that, like, okay, do you need to change something about the environment, or what, you know, what's the, should they be distressed, or are you just distressed and kind of have to accept that that's where they're at? You know, I think that those are some of the questions you have to ask them yourselves. But I think for people that are really, you know, their behavior says that they're really struggling, then absolutely, you're going to have to say, like, okay, you know, I can't really, you know, I can't watch you just, you know, waste away because you're not eating. Like, that's not an option. Let's figure out what to do about that. And I think, you know, I work a lot of college students that are really scared to talk to their parents about things. And then sometimes they talk to their parents and they're like, I can't believe how supportive they were. And it's like, they, you know, I think it's just like, they're worried about hurting you. They're worried about worrying you. They're worried, you know, I think there's a lot of barriers for that. It feels like a failure to them that they can't do it on their own. I mean, there's a lot that comes up. So I think, you know, if they are not wanting to talk to you, hopefully they're willing to talk to a mental health provider, even a trusted other. There was a, oh, sorry, go ahead, Bobby.
Oh, just a quick comment on this, because I run into this a lot in my house. I find that when I take my kids out to do something totally different, that can be a better setting to get the conversation flowing. So in the house, they're irritated, you know, we're all stressed, whatever. But, you know, I took my daughter out to lunch the other day, and it was just a good way to kind of get a discussion going.
Yeah, I think I often have to drag my kids to take walks with my dog, but then I'm always like, I can't believe what they talked about while we were walking. Like, they would never have sat down and talked to me about that in the house, right? There's no way. So I think that's a great point, right? Of like that, not having it be this like intense thing, right? But really being a, you know, how do we talk about these things? I did want to answer one question that says, I have 2 daughters with ADHD. While they take medication, wondering if this could be reframed as a good thing because their brains work so fast. Am I helping or hurting by trying to reframe this diagnosis? Yeah, I mean, I think anything we can do to destigmatize is really helpful. I think kind of how the mental health field understands ADHD right now is really, it is a brain-based neurological issue. And I think, you know, that's something we've known for at least 80 years, if not longer. It's been called a lot of different things, but I think we've known that there's a brain functioning base. And I think the main theory or hypothesis based on kind of the imaging that we're able to do, and unfortunately, I think the technology for diagnosing ADHD accurately is still a little bit behind, but I think we're going to get there pretty soon in terms of being able to do it from a brain scan. But what I understand is it's actually their brains are like understimulated, and so they need more stimulation, right? And I think it's actually an adaptive thing. It's just not so adaptive in the classroom when you're being asked to sit still and listen and, you know, write for hours a day, right? To have a brain that's seeking stimulation is actually is really creative and is gonna, you know, pick up things in the environment that other people are missing. You know, these are the people that were great scouts. They were great, you know, leaders and adventurers preschool. School is really hard and, you know, we're talking about 1 in 10 kids, right? And it's just, it makes sense. Our brains are wired differently as humans because we all need to be good at different things. If we were all good at the same things, that wouldn't be very effective civilization. So it really is, it is a strength. I think it's just, it gets to be really hard in a classroom. And so I think, yeah, any way that you can reframe that and help them understand, like, this is not something wrong with you, right? It's just neurodiversity, right? And so how do you capitalize on that strength and also compensate for what kind of the shadow side of that strength is, just like all of us, you know, we all have different strengths and weaknesses. And so how do you kind of really appreciate the strengths, but also know it's your responsibility to figure out how to manage what doesn't work for you. And that's okay. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong. It just means that you're responsible for managing it.
Thank you. Do you see another comment that we have? I read in Sean Anker's book, The Happiness Advantage, that exercise is a better antidepressant than any of our other antidepressants. Would you agree? And if so, are there any other best practices to get your kids to exercise? Like, do they need
That's great.
HIIT? I'm not sure.
HIIT training.
Or just a walk to see the benefits.
High intensity interval training. You know, I'm not an exercise physiologist by any stretch of the imagination. I am a former collegiate athlete, though, so I'm a big fan of athletics and exercise, and that's probably the most important way that I know I cope and manage my mental health. So I definitely have a bias towards that. I think what the research says is that for mild to moderate depression, exercise can be just as good as an antidepressant. So what's important about that is for severe depression, that's not true. And that there are people that have a certain level of depression. And I think I would encourage people to go to a psychiatrist that practices functional medicine if you're interested in this, because you're going to work with somebody who is going to look more holistically at nutrition and exercise as well as medication. And I think when looking at all of that, again, not a psychiatrist, not a physician, not an exercise physiologist, but as a psychologist, I think exercise is incredibly important. And I think the piece I don't know about, I mean, I think that there is something to what happens on a cellular level when you do more intense exercise versus, more moderate exercise, which I know is why the recommendation is getting your heart rate a certain, like getting it high in a certain way as the general recommendations around physical activity, because actually that is important from a health benefit, cardiovascular perspective and cellular perspective. And also mental health. I think it just can stimulate the neurotransmitters in a way that's really important. And so I am a proponent of, walking and higher intensity exercise as well. I think though, it really depends. I mean, I see some people who can like moderate, walking is sufficient. I see some people with exercise, no matter how much they try it, it really doesn't have an impact. And then for some people it's life-saving. So I think it's really individualized, but as a general rule, we know that we probably aren't moving enough. Our kids, especially right now, probably aren't moving enough, and really shooting for that hour of some sort of exercise a day. And that it's kind of like the fruits and vegetables, like you're shooting for 5 fruits and vegetables every day. Sometimes you might just eat 3, right? And like, that's better than 0. So I think that knowing the goal and knowing that and I think, are there things that motivate your kids to do that? Do you, someone just asked about a functional medicine doctor. The one I work with doesn't work with kids, but I can try to get that for that person. So anyways, I think like that, keeping that in mind and having that perspective of I think especially kids that are dealing with more mild depression, before you move to having them start to go on medication, I absolutely would see about their nutrition and their exercise, because I think we can see a big impact on that. I think more severe depression, I mean, that's what I'll say to the clients I work with. If you come in here and tell me that you're really suicidal all the time, I'm going to have you see the psychiatrist. If you tell me that you're functioning okay, but you wish you weren't so sad, let's talk about the things you can do in your life that are going to help you feel better. And some people are like, I don't want to exercise, I just want the medication, and that's fine too. I think it should help them. Antidepressants should help even mild to moderate depression, but absolutely can be just as good for people.
Great information. Thank you. We've got another question here. What type of psychologist would you recommend for a 3rd grader who's currently struggling with mental health?
That's a great question. I mean, I think mostly at that age, they're going to be doing a combination of play versus talk therapy. I mean, it's so hard. There's like so many phenomenal mental health practitioners out there. I'm not as familiar with the child world here in Denver, but I do, or in Colorado, but I do know some. But I think that um, I think really just someone who specializes in kids. And if your kid is having a specific issue, like ADHD, like OCD, that you want to try to find someone who has that area of expertise, I think that's really important, because there are some diagnoses that require kind of more specialized treatment than others. I think if it's kind of general depression, anxiety, family issues, I think most child psychologists or child therapists, I think, you know, you're going to find a lot of really awesome providers at the master's licensure level as well, LPCs and LMFTs, LCSWs, things like that. So I think I generally look for someone who has a decent amount of experience and that specializes in kids. And, you know, if you can go through your insurance or all that, usually, I mean, the good thing about living in such a big metro area is there's a lot of mental health providers. And I think if, you know, again, I'd be happy to talk to anyone individual about getting them connected to resources, but I know Cherry Creek also has lots of resources on their website in terms of how to access mental health providers too.
This is your last chance, folks. Get your questions in. While we're waiting to see if there's any more questions, I just want to remind you that save some time on Thursday evening for the last of Kent Denver's Parent Education Speaker Series. PhD Lisa Damore, author of Under Pressure, Confronting the Epidemic of Stress and Anxiety in Girls, is going to speak. This opportunity is only available to us, Penn, live, not recorded. So if you are not already on our Penn email list, please get to our website and sign up for our email list immediately so you can get that information. The speaker on Thursday will start at 6:30, and you can get on our email list via our website, pennccsd.com. And
I just read that question. I want to add one thing to that question, because I think I missed the part about them struggling with goodness of fit and that they've already tried some people. I think what we see all the time in college is the person that's like, my parent made me go to therapy when I was a kid, but it didn't help because I didn't want to go, you know? And so goodness of fit is probably actually the most important thing, especially, and really getting the kids buy-in, you know, like this is, you know, like if you broke your leg, you'd go to the doctor, you know, like what, this is what we do when this part of our brain is, you know, glitchy, or we're struggling in this area. And I need to find someone who you're willing to talk to and want to work with. And I think just like any field, there's some really fantastic therapists out there, and there's some that aren't as good. And I think that goodness of fit is probably the most important, especially if someone's tried a bunch already. And so it might really also be getting the buy-in, like, do you like this person? Like, what's hard? Or are they just like, I really don't want to talk to a stranger about this? And, you know, that's something then you might need to do a little bit more around the buy-in of like, for them to know why they should go, what would be helpful about it, what they could get out of it, really, that they're only going to get something out of it if they kind of go along and try to figure out, even if it's play therapy, you know, like they're going to want you to play with this stuff. And I think like, this is a cool adult who can spend some time with you and have fun with you. So, you know, how do they make the best of that so they can try to get something out of it? That's a tough one though, because I think I hear it all the time. They're like, my parents are basically right. I needed to go, but I didn't want to go. So I like didn't get anything out of it. So, I mean, there's not a whole lot you can do about that, especially when they're in college and you're like, well, I'm glad you're here now. So.
great reminders. It looks like we don't have any more questions right now. We were collecting email addresses for any of those people who would like any additional resources, Jacaranda, that you may have
Great.
as suggestions. So get those in the chat right now and we will collect those. Thank you for this information. I took pages of notes and if you think to all the people in your immediate family and then go out one circle and another circle and another circle, and you think, all of us come to Penn usually for our immediate circle, and yet you will see that what you learn here at Penn with these amazing speakers and presentations that we have is that you are helping all these external circles around you of people in your community, in your greater community. And we thank you for being positive influences for your community and the world. So thank you, Jacaranda, for a great presentation. I'm just making sure that we're getting all kind of nice words here. Thank you for your presentation. So much appreciated. Remember to sign up for our emails so you can hear more about Thursday's event and April 6th. And until April, we're not in charge of Thursday. So until April, hang tight and we'll see you next month. Happy March.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.